Welcome to the second of In Hope's Expert Insight series, funded under the European Union's Better Internet for Kids programme, which In Hope has benefited for many years and started under what used to be what the Better Internet for Kids programme used to be, the Safer Internet programme. This afternoon, we're joined by Hannah Rose, who is a Senior Research and Policy Manager for Extremism at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, ISD, based out of London. A think and do tank is how she described it to me, where she and her colleagues research far-right extremism and anti-Semitism online. Hannah is also a PhD candidate in war studies at King's College London, and she brings an extremely impressive depth of expertise to this space already at such a young age. And this includes previous work at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation, or ICSR, focused specifically on young people's involvement in violent extremist networks, which makes her extremely relevant to present to us today. She'll be walking us through the findings of ISD's landmark report, Beyond Extremism, Platform Responses to Online Subcultures of Nihilistic Violence. Before Hannah begins, please do take a moment to look at the guidelines that just come up on the screen in front of you. Today's session does cover difficult and at times disturbing material, and we want everybody to feel able to engage with this safely, to feel comfortable during this webinar. If you do need to step away at any point, please do so, or simply you can leave. Mics and cameras are muted and off throughout this, but you can place your questions, if you have any, for Hannah in the chat, and we will take them at the end. I will now be passing over to Hannah. Hannah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that kind introduction and for inviting me to present today. Really looking forward to the discussion and hearing about how the topics that I'm going to discuss reflect with everyone's work here. Firstly, I just wanted to pay tribute to the work of In Hope, who are really at the coalface of a lot of the harms that we look at as well. And also, I'm sure many people watching this as well will be really doing incredibly important work. So firstly, thank you for your work, and I hope we can kind of have a discussion together. I'm going to now share my screen, and I hope that is visible. Samantha, can you just give me a yes?
Yes, okay? No, I can't see it. Maybe one of my colleagues can tell me if they. Okay, now I can. Yeah, good.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. Firstly, a quick intro to ISD. We are a think and do tank, like Samantha said, which is a bit of a strange way of framing it, but the point that we want to get across with that phrase is that we don't just do research, we develop policies and action programming to counter a wide range of threats to democracy. So we have a threat detection, analysis and prevention arm, which looks at identifying at scale these harms and understanding how they flow, who perpetuates them and what they look like. We do a lot of work on policy, on platform, working on platform harms, working with governments across the world to enforce them. And we do action programming, and we use that to inform our education work, our intervention work across a range of harms. And that can really range from hostile state misinformation operations and information operations to online hate extremism, and now these kind of new trends and new threats that are coming through as well. So I suspect I might come at this topic from a slightly different area compared to a lot of people in this call. But I'd be really interested to hear how that tracks with your experience, and hear your feedback at the end as well. I'm going to aim to speak for around probably 35 minutes, and then take questions at the end. So here's the big picture that we're looking at ISD across extremism online more broadly. And I'll start there and I'll kind of come into how this tracks with the topic that we're discussing today. The extremism landscape has dramatically changed from what I think a lot of people would conceptualize 20 years ago, a lot of which is to do with social media. And nowadays we see a shift away from groups. So whereas you used to be able to kind of name a group, name its leader, understand where they were meeting, in what pub, what rallies they were hosting. It's now a lot more fluid than that. There's a wider set of online networks, individuals, group chats, where people don't necessarily have formal affiliations to formal groups, but are still able to operate in the same way. And a lot of that is due to social media. Anyone's able to go online and find a really harmful group, unfortunately, really harmful network in a way which they couldn't necessarily access it and needed that structure a while ago. And what that means is that what used to be kind of top-down ideology is now a lot more grassroots, people picking and mixing from different networks in ways which kind of often contradicts or kind of forms a much looser relationship with how counter-extremism practitioners more broadly understand and define ideology. We call this hybridization. So you see increasingly, rather than these formal categories of actor, far-right, Islamist, let's say, there's a much more broader spectrum of harms, people involved in kind of all ideologies and none. And there's a much more aestheticized community element to online extremism than there used to be. So people don't just operate through a set of online messages, they operate through new systems of meaning where aesthetics, that's memes, that's graphic design, has an entirely different in-group signal. The best way I can describe this is, if you ever, I don't know how many of you will be on TikTok or how many of you won't be on TikTok, but we know someone who is on TikTok and will be shown a kind of a TikTok that's says, you know, oh, look at these people, isn't this funny? And you're thinking, who is that? What do they mean? I don't understand this reference. But these references mean entirely different things to different sets of people. And a lot of these subcultural codes are really relevant to online nihilistic communities, but not necessarily apparent to the untrained eye. So this is the very messy extremism landscape that we come at this problem from. It's not just a set of groups, it's not just a set of obvious behaviors, it's far more mixed, far more fluid across the online environment. Nihilistic violence, we define at ISD as a violent act which lacks an ideological motivation and is driven by a misanthropic worldview. We define it that way because it has quite a complex relationship with the way that counter-extremism more broadly understands ideology. So on the one hand, you have someone who may be, for example, motivated or linked to an Islamist network, which clearly has an ideological goal. Their target reflects an ideological goal. They want to create social or political change, and they signal that in a number of ways, through a manifesto, through the use of imagery, through claiming an attack on behalf of a group, for example. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum nihilistic violence, which is motivated by misanthropy, violence for the sake of violence, not necessarily any kind of group-based enmity in the same way that you conceptualize extremism, but is doing quite similar acts, motivated in the same way, but often just for notoriety, for clout, for showing off to followers, for feeling like they're a part of something. And that relates to some often quite random or interpersonal targets. Going back to my slide before, the subcultures online are often very, very young. And there's a lot of children in particular who are targeted by these networks. That is also the case that a lot of children are perpetrating these harms. And in many cases, you have children operating as dual victim perpetrators, doing a lot of harm to their peers, but equally have a number of those vulnerabilities and were motivated to do that harm by a number of those vulnerabilities themselves. And so we conceptualize, and there's quite a lot of debate in the sector, which I'd be happy to engage with if anyone was interested in questions later, but I won't kind of get too deep into concepts now. We view nihilistic violence as conceptually different from ideologically motivated extremism, but linked, mobilized in the same spaces, and necessary to counter from an integrated perspective. However, the key point that I think comes across in our report, which Samantha mentioned and throughout this presentation as well, is that this unique threat requires really bespoke intervention. So rather than just taking a counter-extremism, counter-terrorism apparatus, which was designed effectively after 9/11 to counter Islamist threats, group-centric, ideologically motivated, and transplanting it onto very young people, which is highly punitive and often very ideologically focused. We need to reconceptualize how we approach this problem to make sure that we're not missing anything, that no one falls through the cracks, and that we're actually able to safeguard and protect young people who are really vulnerable in these online spaces. To give you a bit of an idea of who the kind of key drivers and key networks within this space, we have the wider COM network, in particular 764, which emerged from COM in 2021. And this is often focused on the forced production of child sexual abuse material, as I'm sure many in this network will come across before, and the promotion of violence, forced performance of violence act. There's a number of kind of groups that have ebbed and flowed, come and gone, such as No Lives Matter, Maniac Murder Cult, or MMK. Some of these groups are getting banned in different countries under terrorism legislation, which is, as we've kind of already discussed, perhaps conceptually quite difficult if they're not motivated by an ideology, and often terrorism demands definitionally an ideology. That we're becoming concerned that terrorist and counter extremism infrastructure is being used to bolt on new challenges which aren't necessarily appropriate for the nature of the threat. To give you an idea of 764, it's active globally, and we've seen more than 200 individuals arrested in 28 countries for a number of harms. And members who carried out these attacks are often glorified. It operates often like a fandom where people are celebrated for the harm that they've perpetrated. And increasingly, although this is kind of, I think 764 is typically understood as a sextortion network, we're seeing real world violence perpetrated by individuals affiliated with 764 networks. And we've seen a number of mass violence plots and attacks across the US and also globally. So it's really quite a significant network across a number of countries. Another kind of key network in nihilistic violence communities more broadly is called the true crime community, which I'll refer to as TCC, which is broadly an online fandom for people interested in true crime media, which by itself obviously is not inherently harmful, but there is a subculture within true crime interests where people obsess and fixate over high profile killers and seek to enact similar acts of violence in copycat style attacks. And we found at least 15 school shootings or disruptive plots linked to this TCC fandom or community since January 2024, including a number of high profile ones in Minneapolis and in Graz in Austria. So there's a lot of overlap between these adjacent ecosystems, including also with gore communities, so individuals fixated with gore and violence, not necessarily for an ideological motive, and a part of extreme right communities, which is called saints culture, where individuals who have committed very violent, very fatal far-right attacks are sainted, are lionized as saints, as people who should be celebrated, and people are motivated to carry out similar attacks and copycat them in order to kind of impress followers and gain notoriety within the community. This is where the overlap with ideology becomes a bit more grey, because while people may be interested in people who've committed violence for ideological purposes, it doesn't necessarily mean those people are interested because it's ideological. It could just be because it's gore, because it's violence fixation more broadly. This is a really dynamic community where it doesn't always encourage violence, but there's a kind of implicit glorification and celebration of these kinds of attacks, which has the potential to mobilize others in this very networked online community. This seems to have shifted slightly. I apologize. I think the spec has changed slightly. There we go. That's better. The online network of nihilistic violence ecosystems is very decentralized. Like I said, there's no one leader. It's cross-platform and it's highly agile. So they use a different range of platforms for different purposes. You can see here a kind of an attempt at a Venn diagram. Whether or not you think it works, you'd be welcome to feedback on. I think it's quite difficult to visualize and conceptualize a lot of these overlaps, where they use different platforms for different things. So they may use some for victim identification, some for internal communications, and some for live streaming really harmful acts. And of course, some of them are used for all three. Of course, that's not to say that, you know, these platforms aren't attempting to mitigate these harms in many cases. It just means that there's very violent online communities which use platforms in order to funnel people to increasingly closed and harmful ecosystems. And so in some cases, there's mainstream platforms which are the start of that funnel, where there's no concrete indicators of harm, where they are quickly moved off into other platforms where that harm is incubated. So it's important to understand this ecosystem as a whole. It's not one platform that can solve it. It's not one platform that's the problem or whose fault it is. There is a manipulation of platform functions here in order to identify victims and get them into extremely harmful spaces. We've had a go here at a harms taxonomy to just try and show the ways in which harm is mobilized. And I think it's quite easy to think about this just as violence, whereas actually there's a much wider range. And these three categories, sexual offences, cyber harms, and real world violence, is actually a harms matrix first originated from COM itself. We've broken down this into subcategories to take a look at the exact types of behaviours and activities being conducted. And we've also added on the bottom these kind of cross-cutting harms, understanding the perhaps more intangible harms to the victims around psychological impacts, mobilisation to violence, and desensitisation to violence. Different platforms kind of tackle these issues in different ways, depending on their infrastructure, how long they've been trying to get at this problem, and also to some extent how willing they are to build these networks in order to be able to build the infrastructure to address these harms as well. And in this report, we mapped. Is it here? Yes. In the report I mentioned before, we mapped these harms against platforms which we know a number of these networks operate, against their community guidelines, to see how well the community guidelines were stacked up to deal with this new set of harms. I call this a new set of harms because, coming at this from a counter-extremism perspective, it's often understood only as a kind of sharing of propaganda, mobilization to violence, and kind of a violence issue, whereas actually here we've got doxing, we've got sexual harms in a way which aren't always as apparent on kind of what we would typically imagine as extremist networks. And the good news here is that actually we found that platforms are quite well equipped to deal with this range of harms. I've got here, the table is only the categories under sexual offences, but you can see that broadly we've got yeses. There's a number of these policy areas are well covered. Some platforms, usually the larger ones, have longer and more comprehensive community guidelines than some of the other ones. In particular, sexual offences and incitement to violence are reasonably well covered. There's a slightly more mixed picture for some of the cyber harms, where there's some emerging areas such as doxing and swatting, which aren't necessarily are kind of newer and emerging and aren't as well articulated or understood. But the good news here is that this is broadly covered. The bad news is that this is often quite siloed. So we see that often the people who deal with child safety aren't as integrated into the teams that deal with counter-extremism and counter-terrorism, aren't as integrated into the cyber harms teams. And so perhaps our concern here is that the policy areas within platforms are siloed and aren't understanding how they all connect together in a wider network, which is operating in order to kind of deliver all these different harms at scale. And so while much of this content is overtly violative, this is actually, again, quite good news. It means the burden of decision making on platforms, you know, does this violate our policy? Is this illegal or not? Often isn't relevant because it's so harmful, a lot of this content, that it should be readily able to be taken down or blocked, for example. But and one of the points which will run across this presentation is promoting this understanding of how these harm areas intersect. And that's why I'm so pleased to present to this group today, because I think it increases that cooperation across sectors against a shared threat. I wanted to touch briefly here on government responses beyond platforms more broadly. This is a policy paper which we published in the UK a couple of months ago in response to a number of inquiries and investigations into these exact policy questions, often sparked by an attack a couple of years ago, which I imagine many people on this call will be familiar with, where an individual who was fixated with violence and had researched attackers but wasn't necessarily motivated by an ideology himself, attacked a dance class of young children in Southport and tragically killed 3 girls. And since that question, there's been a bit of a reckoning in the UK around how do we respond to an individual who had been referred to the counter-extremism programme Prevent 3 times, but wasn't adopted as a case because he didn't have an ideology. So the question here is, how can we make sure that counter-extremism and counter-radicalisation programming, which almost demands an ideology and seeks to ideologically de-radicalise an individual, that can be protected for the individuals who need it, while we can also make sure people aren't slipping through the cracks and we're supporting people who have a different relationship with ideology, but operate many of the same harms, are motivated in many of the same spaces, and have many of the same vulnerabilities as those with ideologies. And so some of the proposals in this paper, and they're similar to the proposals made by the independent review of Prevent and a number of other key publications since then, is to flip the script slightly. So instead of trying to identify whether someone has an ideology or not, and therefore whether we're able to help them or not, try and look at the harms and behaviours which they're exhibiting, and then triage them appropriately through what Lord Anderson, the independent review of Prevent, calls a big front door. So you enter into the safeguarding system if you are vulnerable, and then a number of different support services could be available to you, only one of which is relevant to ideology and de-radicalisation, but a number of which can help you in a number of different ways. And this comes back to my initial point around how a lot of children are involved in these networks who are extremely vulnerable and who need that support as a demobilisation mechanism, and also because young people need safeguarding support in many other cases as well. So this is a bit of a conceptual framework that we offered a couple of months ago, and which I'll link to at the end as well if you're interested. And I'm happy to talk more about how that tracks against the prevention system more broadly, but I don't want to be too UK focused there, although I know many of these issues are shared by practitioners in many different countries as well. I'm now going to speak more concretely about prevention and platform policies, beyond just policies themselves, and what platforms can do and what civil society can do to respond to this threat. We, ISD, and I know a number of other organisations do as well, use the public health model for violence prevention, which is a ideology agnostic way of minimizing risk factors while boosting protective factors at all levels of the process. This is, by its name, taken from public health, right? So how do you prevent disease from taking hold? How do you stop it spreading? How do you cure it when it has taken hold? And it's the same thought process with violence prevention. So all the way from primordial prevention to foster healthy communities, primary prevention to build individual resilience, to mobilisation to violence, whether that's ideologically motivated or not, then through to secondary prevention. So intervening while someone is becoming engaged in potentially harmful behaviours, and then tertiary prevention, which is focused on reintegration, rehabilitation of those who are already engaged in harm. And we've slightly mapped opportunities for prevention that we've seen onto this framework. By adopting an ideology agnostic and behavioural approach to threat assessment, it means you're not looking for a group's name or affiliation in order to be able to act, and you're not looking for an ideology in order to be able to act. You can recognise the intersection of extremism with nihilistic violence communities, and act on that basis. And so in the primary space, one of the key kind of pieces of good that can be done here is enhancing platform level safeguards, where platforms can work with other actors to be able to provide expert resources, develop community education campaigns around involving threats, and making sure that that information can get to parents and caregivers is such a key part of this. And in the UK, I keep coming back to this example, in the UK, the National Crime Agency has done some excellent communication on this, particularly around school holidays where that risk is elevated, and kind of the more that parents and caregivers can be informed of the potential harms, what to look out for and how to provide support, the better. And this could also be integrated into platform level interventions, building information boxes, making sure that there are effective ways of providing that information to people at risk. The second point in the primary prevention space is to build resilience to nihilistic threats. This looks different from what building resilience to extremist or ideological threats look like. And there are some really promising approaches here, using inoculation-based models. So effectively, think about it like a vaccine, right? Micro dosing, giving someone a small piece of misinformation or of harm online, and teaching them what it is, and then they are more able to recognize that harm when it is given to them in a number of different scenarios. So this isn't teaching people what to think in a way which is not ideologically agile, but it's helping people understand what the strategies used to manipulate them are online, and that will be useful across a number of harm areas, including resilience to fraud, for example, as well. And there's some really interesting gamified models which can be used here, which we can borrow from other harm areas. So, for example, the bad news game has been successful in helping people understand hostile state propaganda or information operations. And effectively what you do is you try to become a kind of someone who manipulates someone else online, and through that, in a gamified environment, and through that you understand what those strategies are used and why they use them. So there's some really promising approaches here that can be transplanted onto this issue set. And in some cases, you can empower community level interventions, particularly in TCC spaces, which are often quite closed and quite difficult to access from outsiders. They are quite strongly, they have a quite strong model of community policing. So moderators are quite strict and able to moderate their own spaces. So as much as we can reach moderators in these found in different spaces, give them bystander intervention tools, help them to understand what off-ramping resources are and how they can provide them to those potentially at risk, then we have a way of accessing communities that we might not otherwise be able to access. In the secondary level, again, the main way in which this is done in counter-extremism is through counter-communications, which has perhaps a bit more of a mixed pattern of success for a number of reasons. When it comes to counter-communications in nihilistic violence communities, again, you're not looking at convincing someone they're wrong ideologically, where that ideology doesn't exist. There are a lot more innovative ways of doing this, and this would actually need to engage with a lot of these subcultural elements which make these communities tick, like subcultural humor, the aesthetic movements in which they operate, in order to be able to cut through to people. And so we need kind of a more innovative and agile way of approaching counter communications, rather than just posting a kind of diverging set of messages to the ones that they're already promoting. And of course, where ideology doesn't exist, ideological de-radicalization won't work. And often it pushes people further away. It kind of might make people think, might entrench people's beliefs, or which they already have about ideology, about authority, about people trying to get at them, around them doing wrong. And so approaching sensitively and targetedly is really vital here. And tertiary prevention, perhaps most importantly, is making sure that where people are on the cusp of engaging in really highly harmful behaviours or victimization themselves, that they are able to understand what support services are available to you, like the hotlines in Hope's network. And as much as platforms can facilitate that being readily available to individuals at the point of relevant intervention where they're looking for that information, the better, through a number of ways, through identifying keywords that may be relevant, You know, I'm sure many of you will know the example of if you type in during the COVID pandemic, when you typed in something to do with COVID into the space bar, you get into the search bar on Instagram, for example, you get a little information box saying, telling you good information about vaccines, where to go to find reliable information. That could be rolled out across the range of harms that we've discussed in this webinar. Also, perhaps using aesthetic triggers as well in order to get people at the point of necessary intervention. In terms of kind of more downstream responses, there's again some really good opportunities here. One of the ways in which this network stays really active is they are incredibly resilient to moderation. Often individuals will have dozens of sock puppet accounts, of kind of fake accounts, email addresses, burner phones, different profiles, so that they know that they're going to get moderated. They know that they're posting illegal material, and they are resilient to the impacts of moderation. They already have backup accounts set up so that their network of followers can just follow them immediately over to that backup account. They funnel people already into a different platform, so the network of followers is already there. So what that has meant, as we've observed through our work, is that when someone gets their account blocked or removed by moderators, they're able to just carry on as were. So we need a much more tailored and dynamic approach to ecosystem disruption to be able to actually get at these networks. The first way in which this can be done, from our view, is to consider how ban evasion markers can be and regrouping codes can be built into moderation practices. For example, if you'll see sometimes people put in their bio a link to their backup page for when they get moderated, which people can already follow. However, a moderator, when they are removing an account or blocking an account which has produced illegal material, might not automatically consider to go onto that backup account and also remove that. So those kind of codes or strategies can be integrated, hopefully, into moderation practices in order to be able to capture the spread of CSAM online, for example, much more robustly, and making sure that there is a kind of elevated level, instead of someone just being blocked, setting up a new account on the same device, same email address, no problem. IP address fingerprinting, device fingerprinting could be used in order to make sure that these burner accounts aren't just kind of set up in the hundreds, and when one bit gets blocked, you easily move on to the next. There's also some opportunities for more dynamic ecosystem disruption. As I said before, these networks leverage a huge range of platforms, and so one platform's attempt to disrupt illegal the spread of illegal content, such as CSAM, will be hampered by the fact that they can just move on to another platform. Europol, for example, has done previously quite successfully these action days. So recently they did one where they looked at terrorist content online targeting minors. This is ideologically motivated content, where they kind of coordinated, researched, brought together a number of platforms, and then at once removed all those accounts, all that illegal material at once. And so this could be really well replicated, and it could have really good success in this nihilistic violence ecosystem, rather than just kind of removing one platform, which will then just rebound somewhere else, really disrupt how they're able to do business. And finally, of course, this problem is too great for one platform, one network, one community, one researcher to deal with. And so any information sharing, knowledge sharing space where the mechanisms for joining up approaches to identifying codes, markers, strategies, harms online, and can be shared with platforms themselves, should be very welcome. And that is across sectors. This is not just a counter-extremism sector problem. It's not just a child safety problem. It's not just a tech problem. The more that we can create synergies and co-working environments between those sectors, the more successful we will be. So just to conclude, and I'd love to hear your feedback, your thoughts, how this tracks with your work, and any questions. I have argued that we need to be much more agile to the diminished role of organised groups, which have given way to communities, online networks, and sets of individuals who engage in lots of different group chats and channels all at once. my concern is that, and we've seen this, and it's not unhelpful, but it's not going to build the solution, is some governments have sought to identify, let's say, 764 as a group and ban them as a terrorist group, but where they don't function as a group, where people aren't members and can't really be proved to be attached to them, that will have a really limited impact. I would encourage us to think much more broadly and out of the box about how this whole harm landscape operates, and how we need to perhaps rejig our counter-extremism and child safety apparatus to this threat landscape. Includes much more cross-agency coordination across sectors, like I said, and building wider prevention efforts across those different harm areas: terrorist content, extremist content, hate violence. This is not necessarily an issue for ideological disengagement, and so programs like Prevent won't work, and neither should they necessarily be designed to work where they are relevant for the continued ideologically motivated threat. Rather, we need to make sure that bespoke protective and safeguarding programs, particularly for young people, are accessible and are able to understand the specificities of the victim-perpetrator duality. And it's vital that this is all communicated to caregivers and frontline practitioners. Many of the kind of risk factors or vulnerabilities which are relevant to online radicalization might also be relevant to nihilistic violence. And a lot of these are safeguarding concerns, first and foremost: social isolation, digital illiteracy, poor mental health, adverse childhood circumstances. And so instead of securitizing them and effectively a mental health crisis landing on the lap of counterterrorism practitioners, a much more safeguarding forward response, also just to kind of improve society more broadly, should be understood as a way of protecting young people. And finally, when we do seek to do these interventions, it's vital that we engage with the specific nature of how these networks operate, with a continually updated research agenda, making sure that with how rapid these networks evolve, that we're able to keep up and make sure that our interventions are appropriate and that they work. And that involves understanding the aesthetic subcultural environment in which a lot of these networks operate, their relationship to ideology or not, which is always in flux, and how this can be a stepping stone to other forms of harm more broadly. So I'll share with you here 3 of the resources which I've referenced today. The first one is the policy paper, the platform policy paper that we did with the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. The second is a more practitioner-focused resource on the behaviours and the accelerants of nihilistic violence communities. And the third is the UK-focused policy paper, which I mentioned before, which does speak to the UK, but hopefully has some ideas that can be applicable in the rest of the world as well. And so I'll leave it there for the moment. I'd love to hear any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Obviously, you've given us a very provocative, a lot to think about, and what you've sort of shared with us through your research, through the work that you've been doing at ISD is obviously both a challenge and I think a genuine call to action to everybody on this call, and definitely the wider community. The idea that the boundaries between violent extremism and the wider identity-based violence that you've talked about, and that blurring is it complicates things even more to a certain extent. And obviously, I represent InHope's members, and we're delighted that you've shared this with us. This kind of the message about bespoke, protective, and safeguarding programming for young people, and proactively communicating risk factors to caregivers and those frontline practitioners resonates deeply, because that's the world that they are operating in every day. I haven't seen if there is, I think there's one question at this moment in time, and I've got a couple myself, but I'll let the others that are the one that's here come first. So where's it gone? Oh. Would misanthropy accelerationism not be considered the presence of an ideology?
Yeah, it's a big debate in the sector at the moment, isn't it? It's it's certainly an argument, and I perhaps don't want to get too tied up in this, because I think if there's some clarity to the response if we can focus on behaviours and harms. The way that we at ISD approach this issue is we understand extremism as an in-group, out-group based enmity. In other words, me and people like me hate you and people like you for inherent characteristics, race, gender, sexuality, for example, and have a supremacist worldview on that basis. So we're better than you, and we should act in order to preserve our in-group identity, and you are a civilizational threat to us, is typically how we conceptualize extremism. And that's kind of based on a broader framework from J.M. Berger, which is an excellent book. He has an excellent book called Extremism. On that basis, nihilism or nihilistic violence communities, which are based on violence for the sake of violence, don't really care who me and people like me and you and people like you are, and they don't think I'm better than you, and they don't think I'm a threat from you. They just care about causing chaos. There is an element of that is certainly relevant to accelerationism. Typically, where we've seen accelerationism manifest, that also comes with some element of ideological motivation, for example, on the extreme right. Typically, it's people who want to advance a race war. Again, that's based on a supremacist worldview. So this is where this kind of, I had a left-right spectrum graph in early on. That's where that comes in. I would put misanthropy and acceleration kind of in the middle somewhere, where some people, such as the Southport attacker, were just kind of motivated by gore and violence, and others have slightly more complex relationship with ideology. Sometimes that's retrofitted in order to kind of fit what their beliefs are. That, I think, has been a bit of a topic of discussion in governments, and of course it's really important to understand what terrorism is and isn't, because it comes with special powers, which should not be used and abused and should be kept very slim in terms of when they are given. And hopefully what I did in this presentation was try to give ideology agnostic solutions which can address that whole range of harms, whether you're relevant to ideology or not. And so I guess my response to your question more broadly is yes, to some extent, and I don't want that to trip us up too much so that we are not able to think about kind of policies through a more behavioural perspective.
Thank you. We have a question from Dan Mills, who's at TikTok, regarding, can you see these as I'm reading them, Hannah, as well? Can you see them?
I can see some of them, yes.
Okay, regarding the upstream interventions mentioned, specifically counter communications, do you have examples of effective content that engages subcultural humour? Also, do you have recommended partnership platforms that can engage to help create these resources for a global audience? So that's 3 questions. Thanks,
we kind of I can share with you separately some types of campaigns that might be relevant. I haven't seen one which exactly deals with these issues. They tend to be a bit more subversive, and I think ethically difficult sometimes when you are engaging with some of these subcultural elements. Some of the suggestions that I've heard is kind of try and out meme people, campaigns such as your memes are lame, or like your network is lame, in a way which hasn't really been done before. And so I don't know if I've seen specific examples. Obviously, with counter communications, it's really difficult to monitor and evaluate them, and so I would want to roll them out in a way which is tested. A lot of the difficulties that we've seen with countercoms over kind of the counter extremism experience is that a lot of them be measured in likes and clicks and speaking to people who kind of already agree with us, rather than measuring behavior and attitudinal change. And we have kind of toolkits for being able to do that, but it's not as well practiced as we would want it to be. So I don't have a good example, but I am happy to connect separately about what we think might work there. And of course, it will depend on a really nuanced micro-targeting to a specific network, and also a nuanced understanding of what's going on in that exact network at that exact moment. So kind of a rapid response deployability based on a kind of a situation room type capability, which we're looking to develop and are kind of mid-developing as well. So we're happy to discuss that separately. To your second question, do you have recommended partnership platforms? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. If it's, are there existing networks? I think there are within the siloed kind of counter-extremism sector, I imagine In Hope is kind of that network for the CSAM sector. But there's kind of, we're working on, and we'd love to be able to facilitate. So again, please do get in touch about this, some kind of cross-sector collaboration on this more broadly. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Please do shout out or respond if there's any that anyone knows of any that you think might be useful to this that I've missed, because that would be really useful to me as well.
And on the first question, I think from what you said, research is needed.
Yeah, exactly. There's kind of, what we're trying to build and conceptualize at ISD is this kind of situation room where we're able to track these movements at scale and innovate responses to the specific behaviors of those movements at any individual time. That's quite difficult to do, but if you deploy the wrong countercom at the wrong time, best case scenario won't work, worst case scenario will backfire. And so a kind of, as I discussed earlier, building in that cross-community, cross-sector knowledge basis, but then being able to translate that into action programming is really important.
Okay, we have a question. Can't see it strong. Is there a common pipeline for individuals, especially young people, to join these groups and subcultures?
I mean, it's kind of the golden question, isn't it? Because if we can pinpoint a shared vulnerability pathway, point of intervention, which would have the greatest likelihood of success, then we're good, right? Unfortunately, there's not typically a common pathway. There are a number of vulnerabilities which we often see relevant to exploit individuals in these cases. Often that's to do with adverse childhood experiences, poor mental health, social isolation is a big one. A number of other ones which are listed in the practitioner resource that I shared earlier. The pipeline, again, given the agility of these online movements which cross different platforms at different times and are often moving to avoid detection, there's not a one platform that is the grooming area. There are some which are more relevant for some spaces. For example, the True TCC spins off of wider true crime networks, right? People who are just fascinated by true crime in a non-problematic way. And you're kind of looking for a needle in the haystack there, because that is such a big community, and the number of people who then go on to be involved in the violence fixation motivated side of TCC is so small. But it's often by kind of picking people out of that network. Let's say this is quite an active network on Tumblr, and then funding to different platforms is often how it's done. There are kind of two ways of getting at this, by the way. There's the online interventions, which I kind of discussed, and then also the offline interventions, which is more upstream, building resilience, helping people understand how they're being manipulated, providing resources to caregivers and parents. And those two things in combo should be able to be a resilient enough approach that when the pipeline moves, or when it's not exactly what we think it is, you're still catching people.
Thank you. And I suppose the bigger question on that is how we respond to that systemically, which I think you've touched on a bit through the prevention model that you talked about, the prevention model that you talked about in response to the vulnerability of so many of these young people, which obviously has to be the way forward. And I know there are a couple more questions that we'll have time to get to, but I wondered if you could respond to the role. We've talked a lot about governments and platforms. I was wondering if you could just mention a little bit more about the response that you think that civil society can play in the approach that you've described.
Yeah, absolutely. Civil society has a huge role to play in producing knowledge, in sharing that with platforms, and also providing really tailored intervention support for individuals, which I think civil society is best placed to do. Such as safeguarding measures. I wouldn't want civil society to adopt what I believe is the responsibility of platforms in many cases. and effectively do that work for platforms, where I think platforms actually have the best access to be able to do this, the best tools, the best understanding of their systems, to be able to deliver these kind of interventions. But there's a huge partnership there, which could be really strengthened. I guess going back to this public health model, and also to the kind of government policy landscape more broadly, all of these demand a cross-sector approach and also cross-harm area approach in order to be able to really understand and deal with this holistically. It needs to be agile, it needs to be ideology agnostic, it needs to be future-proof, right? We don't know what the next thing coming around the corner is, and we don't want to be here in a year or two thinking, oh my gosh, the stuff that we said on the InHope webinar is already out of date.
Sure.
And so behaviours and harms, as much as we can address it from that perspective, then hopefully we won't repeat the mistakes that we've kind of found our way into, not necessarily by any fault, but the roadblocks we've hit when it comes to countering ideologically motivated extremism.
Thank you. There was a question here that I missed before Dan's. What are the characteristics of content/networks targeting minors compared to users in general? Is there a difference? And if these movements are decentralized, what do we know about the active members who are setting up hundreds of accounts and maybe driving communities?
So we don't know much, except for when people are caught effectively. They're often, particularly in high harm spaces, completely anonymous, and are quite good at privacy. So that's VPNs, IP scramblers, those sort of things, in order to be able to not be caught. And so we really don't know a huge amount about them. We know they are probably global. There are a number of cases of people who have been involved in these communities, which are now coming around the tracks, which we're seeing go through the courts, which give us a better idea as to who's perpetrating these harms. But there's kind of not so much known more broadly. In terms of the characteristics of content targeting minors compared to users in general, do you mean, if you mean compared to older users in general? I think a lot of this plays on the types of vulnerabilities which are perceived as specific to minors around identity formation, belonging, looking for a community or a group of friends, particularly when it comes to ideologically motivated extremism. We've seen a number of children really involved over the last few years, more than we had previously, and a number of those cases when they've gone through the courts is effectively, this is vastly oversimplifying it, cases of children who don't fit in at school, can't find a group or network, and go on and find a group of friends online. Again, a lot of people do that in a way which is not problematic, but where you have those vulnerabilities, they are then exploited by harmful actors, and people are funneled into harmful spaces, ideologically motivated spaces, nihilistic violence communities, which they kind of, as a way of finding community and finding people to respect them, to who they feel a part of. And that again comes back to all these aesthetic and subcultural elements around feeling like you're a part of something, feeling like you understand something that someone else doesn't, feeling like you're part of a subversive movement. So apologies if I've slightly missed the point of that question.
No, I think you answered it. We have, please can you explain in some additional detail the link between nihilistic violence, sextortion and CSAM?
So sextortion and production of CSAM are some of the harms or outcomes which are facilitated by nihilistic violence communities. So, for example, a network such as 764, which is kind of part of how we conceptualize one group, I guess one of the more concrete groups within the nihilistic violence network, will exploit young people often, particularly young girls, to share CSAM or to kind of also exploit them more broadly. And then often what they might do is now they have something on that person, might make them exploit someone else, for example. So it is one of the activities which takes place in this network. It's not the only one. Sometimes people are motivated to carry out swatting attacks. Sometimes people are mobilized to conduct acts of self-harm and share it online. And so I would imagine, and as someone that kind of typically doesn't work in the CSAM space and comes at this from a different space, this is a new way in which CSAM might be produced. But CSAM obviously is always, I'm telling you this, being produced, but now it's kind of done in a more, I guess, if you think about it, online organised crime sense. An online gang is using it as a way of getting at people. And so it's a lot more strategic, widespread, and connected to a kind of wider set of things that are also being asked of people.
Yeah. We have another question. I think this might be the last one. Can you share your thoughts on the role of adolescent development as a risk factor within these groups?
I can share my thoughts. I'm not a psychologist, so I suspect someone on this call might be better qualified than me to answer that question, but I'll give my broad thoughts. I published a paper, I think a couple of years ago now, on this specific question when it came to children who'd been convicted of terrorism offences in the UK. And I suspect it's quite a similar scenario for those involved in non-ideological but adjacent online communities, such as nihilistic violence, where, like I mentioned, about identity seeking within young people, trying to find friends, trying to fit in, trying to look cool, trying to show off. And loads of these children at their trial said, oh, I was just trying to show off to my friends. I don't know the extent to which that was true. That was kind of relied upon as a defence because it had worked in previous cases as well. I think, and psychologists have also commented on how this time of identity formation is often, you know, if you think about kind of this perhaps stereotype of childhood rebellion, countercultural seeking, looking to kind of be subversive, perhaps a wider fascination with violence as well sometimes. I think all of these kind of combine into issues, a kind of a person who in any scenario is not necessarily going to commit any form of harm or be involved, but it's kind of a comorbidity alongside going online, happening to end up in these scenarios, being selected for grooming, and that perhaps primes someone to being identifiable and easy to manipulate. And that's particularly among young people who are kind of widely recognised as more vulnerable. But that's why when we come at it from the public health approach, we try and approach it from a how do we help young people to be kind of more resilient, less vulnerable, support them psychologically in the ways that they need, which is good for young people, and then also will have the knock-on impact of reducing the ability for other people to manipulate them online.
Thank you so much. It is 4 o'clock. Thank you so much, Hannah. Just on the last question, I think that although you're not a psychologist, as you say, I think this is exactly why the public health model matters more than ever now, because it allows us to intervene at that level of the underlying vulnerability before it's too late. That's the hope anyway. So thank you so much. This, as you've said, this is not a problem that any one sector can solve alone. This is what we all kind of say again and again at the end of these webinars whenever we're sitting on stages, but it's more true than ever, and it demands exactly the kind of cross-agency, cross-sector coordination you have described. And we need to continue conversations like this, certainly have more research like you've been doing, and working together to make sure that we can continue to advance specifically in this space. And I think everyone is on the same page, but we need to move forward in the same direction. So thank you to Hannah, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Have a great evening or day wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you.